This week's episode of the HP Outdoors Waterfowl podcast is proudly brought to you by Off-Grid Food Company. Off-Grid Food Company's products were born from the countless nights in the wilderness they call their second home. Their goal is to create the premier line of handcrafted foods from real, source-focused ingredients for all your hunts, scouting trips, fishing trips, or regular backcountry adventures. All their products are developed with the rigors of the backcountry in mind and are developed and crafted to help you go the extra distance. Check them out online or on Instagram today. You are listening to the HP Outdoors Waterfowl Podcast, episode 97. This week on the show, the 2018 duck survey numbers have just been released, and we're breaking them down with John Devney of Delta Waterfowl. Right, welcome to the 97th episode of the HP Outdoors Waterfowl Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Palm, and we are your on-demand audio source for all things waterfowl and waterfowl hunting. Check us out at hpoutdoors.com. Find our show across all the various podcast platforms out there, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play Store, iHeartRadio, wherever you can find quality podcast content, you can find our show. You can also check us out across all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can go over to Facebook and join our listeners group. Get in there and chat with a bunch of listeners of the show and also my co-host, Dan Harushka. Dan, what's up, man?
Not too much, man. We are closing in on September 1st. We are a week away from hunting together for the first time in a few years.
Yep.
And excitement is high.
Yeah, I would say that's accurately putting it, that I'm definitely looking forward to next week and getting to hunt with you for the first time in a couple years. But before we go down that road too much more, I want to just take a minute to thank Gunner Kennels, engineered for your dog, designed for travel, and built for your peace of mind. The G1 Kennel has set a new industry standard and put Gunner Kennels in a category all its own. Gunner Kennels was started to protect your pet, and it continues to be at the center of everything that they do. Gunner Kennels is dedicated to building the best and safest pet travel crate on the market. Man's best friend deserves man's best kennel. Check out their G1 series of kennels and accessories at gunnerkennels.com. Also want to thank Bad Grammar Academy, the finest duck and goose calling instruction now available online with Scott Trinan, 3-time world champion. Practice anywhere and anytime with online access to BGA. Give yourself the advantage and learn proven techniques to ensure the best chance to call birds right into your lap this season. Get started today at badgrammaracademy.com. Also want to thank 737 Duck and Goose Calls. Original design, select grade components, superior sound, and unparalleled service. 737 takes exceptional pride in producing the finest quality, best built premium calls in the market today. They're made in America and offered only direct to customer from their website. Shipping in the U.S. is always free, and international orders are also now being accepted online. A 20-day money-back guarantee and a lifetime warranty accompany every call purchased. 737 Duck Calls lead the flock. Also want to thank Mount Airy Waterfowl Club of Warsaw, Virginia, Camp Chef, Black Rifle Coffee Company, and Native Eyewear. Again, guys, the companies that support this show are super important to us, and we're really, we're blessed to have relationships with all of them, so please support them in any way that you can. Some of them have also been able to give us discount codes to pass on to you. You can go over to our website, check out the discount page, and save yourself 10% off at Dunn Sporting Goods, 15% off at Black Rifle Coffee Company, 10% off with White Rock Decoys, 15% off with 737 Duck Calls, and 15% off with Alpha Dog Nutrition. So make sure you get out there and save yourself some dough if you're in the market for some gear. All right, Dan, so the survey numbers are out, and we thought, who better to discuss said numbers than our buddy John Devney over at Delta Waterfowl? And as I'm recording this now, it just turned to Sunday morning, so it's 12:07 a.m. here on the East Coast, Sunday morning. So we're burning the midnight oil to get this one out. You've been on vacation this whole week down at the beach. So you have a good trip?
Yeah, I think we were about 4 hours into actually being at our location when my son fell off a bunk bed ladder and hit his head off a table. And we spent probably 4 hours in the ER getting 3 staples in the back of his head. So besides that, and them telling us that he could not swim or be submerged underwater for 7 to 10 days within being hours at the beach of our, 7-day trip, everything was really, really good after that. But yeah, we started off with a bang for sure.
You sent me that picture of his head split open, and it was gnarly. I mean, it was a nasty gash. And then the next day, the pictures of him in a shower cap running around the beach was hilarious.
Yeah. Well, yes. And well, the thing is, like, all right, so my wife is a physical therapist, so she's at the hospital quite often, but more geriatric stuff she works with, older people. And my twin girls, whenever they see their little brother hurt, they just start freaking out. So once Aaron, like, I was just getting settled in downstairs and I heard a boom. Aaron runs up. She starts yelling for me. Immediately, twin girls screaming at the top of their lungs. And then that sends the wife into panic mode. Then Dawson, who has his head split open, is looking for me. So I make everyone leave. I tell her, get me a washcloth and the keys of the car, and try to Google the nearest emergency room or, any kind of clinic that could get him patched up there. So yeah, it was a pretty hectic first night. And then, after that, yeah, so they said no swimming or, bathtub or shower for 7 to 10 days, just wash it twice a day. I'm like, we literally just got here to the beach and he's not allowed to swim. And we have a pool at the house.
Don't do anything for the next 7 to 10 days that you would do all the time at the beach.
Yeah. Don't do anything that you came here to do. So immediately I'm like, wait, so I was like, is that something that you just have to say, or like, can we kind of get around that? And she's like, the doctor's like, well, like, even like a pool is kind of dirty, and I would say no to that. So if you think about like all the parasites and bacteria in the ocean, and this is as I'm looking at his, head wide open, she's like, if you can see his skull, so if there's water that can get down in there and just start to get infected, like, you're going to have a big issue. So immediately after, the following morning we go and get a shower cap because I couldn't find a swim cap. And then we finally made it to a store where I found a swim cap for 8 years plus, but it actually was good on him and tight enough just to make it down around like the back of his neck. And it worked. So when he had his floaties on, his head and his neck and everything, his shoulders were above water, and he could float around. He could float around the pool with a swim cap. When he was at the beach, it was just way too hot, so he had a purple shower cap and just looked like a chef, and just everyone double taking him. But tried to keep the sand and the water off of him as much as we could. So it was a challenge, but for a 3-year-old, he totally owned it. Like, he did really well and didn't complain too much. Definitely, I think he cried more when I had gauze on his head with tape, medical tape, and when we took that off, I think he cried harder than when they actually put the staples in his head. So he was a soldier, and definitely got the photos to remember the trip by. So yeah, that was good. So upper 80s, lower 90s down there the entire week. Perfect weather. Come back here and got to chill in the air and just put me right into hunt mode. And like we mentioned, we're a week away from hunting the opener together, and I'm severely pumped up. So
yeah, I mean, it's been getting down into the 50s overnight the last couple nights here. It just feels like it's getting real. I'm fired up. So looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to everyone checking out this week's interview with John, because we love having him on the show. He always brings it when it comes to, this type of stuff. And, there's a lot going on right now that, probably a lot of duck hunters aren't aware of, but, he touches on it. There's a big decision coming up on the Atlantic mallard, bag limits. There's the farm bill situation that's coming up that expires on September 5th. Did he say? No, it expires at the end of the month.
The 30th. 30th.
So, we got some really important things as far as duck hunters and, farmers and things are concerned. So, John and the guys at Delta and, them are, working these issues and, we get into that with him on this week. So, why don't we go ahead and, play that interview? It's a good one, and, we'll, catch up here on the other side. All right. Joining us this week is one of our favorite guests, and he's certainly no stranger to the show. It's John Devney of Delta Waterfowl. John, how you doing, man?
Doing great. It's, we're getting close. I'm starting to see doves flock up. My children are asking when Dad's going to start shooting doves and get bacon and jalapenos and cream cheese. And, as I said before we got on the phone, I should have been wearing a jacket this morning. So, yeah, it's getting to be that time of year.
Yeah, it's funny because we were talking here before we started, and you're last week on the show we did kind of like a celebrating the opening day, and we actually recorded it on August 15th, which was opening day in North Dakota, or at least certain parts of North Dakota, and we were talking before we started recording that you live in that area and you're seeing birds flying and stuff like that. And, I always kind of wonder sometimes, it's sort of one of these things that us as the layman waterfowl hunter, it's like, man, it'd be so amazing to have a job that like your life revolved around something that you're passionate about, like duck hunting and, the outdoors and conservation and things like that. But I always wonder, how much, because you're working so much to that end, how much do you really get a chance to get out in the field, particularly like this time of year, and even more so, these years where you've got like midterm elections going on and different policy things that I know that you're big in, involved with. So how much of that stuff kind of pulls you out from being able to actually just get out in the field and spend some time in the blind?
Well, I had a really nice young man that had been applying for a couple of jobs down with Delta down in Arkansas and Tennessee. We were plucking ducks one day, and he said, I just want a job like yours. I said, well, there's two ways to do this. I said, you can have a job like mine and, not make as much money as you can do doing everything, almost anything else in the world and not have time to hunt, or, you go become a hedge fund manager and you're going to fly Delta Airlines and coach, and you have lots of time to hunt and fish. And yeah, it's funny, guys. I mean, before I took the job with Delta, I'd make a couple, I was making trips to Iowa, almost every weekend from the Twin Cities to go pheasant hunting after our duck season. 2 trips to North Dakota, that we're legally allowed to have as a non-resident, make a trip to Lake of the Woods, up and back and forth to north central Minnesota. And, and I think it's, certainly the job has got its demands. I travel an incredible amount for all sorts of things, but I've got a young family too, right? So it's a seasonal life thing. And on the other hand, I don't know if the good Lord owes me a lot more dead ducks. So, the one thing I get is I get to see lots of cool parts of the world that I never, that I read about when I was a kid that, I never thought I'd probably ever see. I've seen the Susquehanna Flats. I've seen the Bear River Marshes. I've seen the Central Valley, Louisiana, Central Valley, California, Louisiana coast. I've seen Biomeda. I've had opportunity to see lots and lots of places. Many of those places I've never hunted, but I've had the opportunity to learn about the culture and learn about the place, which is, again, because the good Lord doesn't owe me a hell of a lot more dead ducks, it's probably about as good as anything.
Man, yeah, and you were saying, you were out working your dog, and you should have wore some warmer clothing. And I'm kind of the opposite because I just got back from vacation. Actually, this morning. This is Saturday that we're recording. This morning at 1 a.m. and it was like upper 80s, 90s the entire time down in Myrtle Beach, and I get back here and then feel the little bit of crispiness in the air, and I was like, all right, it's finally time to get worked up a little bit. So, there are some places open. Are you in a zone that you could be hunting right now, or are you just watching birds fly over and can't shoot them yet?
Yeah, it was interesting because we were dog training on the 16th on the west side of the Missouri River. The three of us from our retriever club were down training, and first bunch of honkers came over, about little family group of 8 came over. I thought, man, I think guy, probably pass shoot a couple of those dudes, and then another 10 came, and another dozen, and then another 25, and another 8. And I thought, man, I made the wrong choice here. I should probably be hunting. And then today, when we wrapped up our land series this morning, there were honkers landing right in the field, right behind us as we pulled the gear out of the field for our land series this morning. And as we turned around to run the water, there were a flock of about 30 honkers dumped in right behind us. And so somebody said, well, there's your diversion bird. And I said, God, I hope not, because my dog is never going to pay attention to a gas duck when there's flying honkers over the top of them.
Can't blame him if I do say.
Out there.
One of we talked about this a little bit off before we started too, but you're one of our favorite guests to have on the show because of just the depth of knowledge that you have on the topic, and we've got some really, really important things that we're going to hit on this week with you in regards, particularly some of the stuff that we're seeing here in the eastern part of the country in the Atlantic Flyway. But I would be remiss if I didn't take us back to the last time you were on the show, and the comments that you were making about the man bun got a lot of run amongst our listeners group. They're a big fan of John Devney now because of just the variety of responses. I don't think anybody saw the man bun coming. So you got a tough act to follow. We're excited to see what this interview is going to bring. If it's going to be more man bun like or something else, we're excited to find out.
Well, it's one of those things. You got to be careful what you say when it's recorded. Years ago, I do a lot of shows with my friends at KFan out of the Twin Cities, Billy Hildebrand and Bob St. Pierre. Bob works for Pheasants Forever, and I've been doing radio with those guys for, I bet you almost 20 years now. And we were talking about rough grouse hunting, and I talked about how my dad, had very strict rules of sportsmanship, and you never shot a duck on the water, you never shot a pheasant on the ground. But my dad had this incredible, desire to put every rough grouse he's ever seen in his mouth. And, his rule was you never shoot a duck on the water, you never shoot a pheasant on the ground, but you shoot every goddamn rough grouse you ever see. If that means it's sitting on a tree limb, you shoot that rough grouse. There's no sportsmanship when it came to rough grouse. And I was driving, this is with my old Seamus dog, and I was driving to a hunt test in Minnesota early on a Saturday morning, happened to be listening to KFan, and rough grouse was the topic. And then, then both Bob and Billy made reference to the fact that I was a ground swatting slob when it came to rough grouse. And my name was invoked, so you got to be careful.
That's funny. Growing up around here, when my brother and I could just start driving, and we weren't really into waterfowl, but we had a couple different dogs, and we'd go small game hunting and stuff. And for the state bird of Pennsylvania being the rough grouse, we don't see very many at all. So we would go pheasant hunting or rabbit, whatever. And the one time we started this new patch of woods, and I get out, and I was like, that's a grouse in that tree. And I was like, Joe, get over here. So he walks over. I was like, is that a grouse? And he goes, yeah, shoot it. He goes, or I'm going to shoot it. So the thing was right on a limb, and I did a clean head takeoff, and there wasn't one one BB in the chest at all in the breast meat. So that's my one rough grouse that I ever killed in Pennsylvania when we were little. But yeah, that's I guess I do the same thing. If it's sitting there, I'm gonna shoot it. So.
Well, that was Jack Devney's favorite way. I don't think my dad shot more than a handful of rough grouse on the wing his entire life, and he had no compunction about it either. He liked eating rough grouse too much to be too terribly torn up about the ethical consequences of ground pounding them.
Yeah, and I don't think that they were ever stalked here. So I mean, this thing, the dog was running around and it was just sitting on a tree limb about head high, and it was different because usually, I saw a couple up in the center of the state. We'd be bear hunting and, going through the thick stuff, and one would take off and you'd about, poop your pants because you thought a bear was coming at you or something. But, they're super loud when they take off. So this was one just sitting there. I'm like, man, all right. But yeah, I think I'd be okay in your dad's book in that one.
It'd be about the only way I could ever kill one.
Be careful what you say when you record it. That's what I've learned it from you guys because I keep seeing the man bun thing keep up with my name tag. It's I don't think that's necessarily the legacy I want, but whatever. I guess you deal with the cards you're dealt, right?
No, I loved that comment, and actually, I think a lot of people got good humor out of that. So there's certainly worse things you could have tied to your name, I guess. But
like a minivan. Yeah, don't worry about the man bun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
But let's shift gears a little bit here, and I guess we'll start kind of talking about some things sort of on the more national scale. And the 2018 duck survey numbers were just released, and I personally don't know always what to make of these numbers when you see, year over year change versus, long-term average change. And, I guess the one thing I try to look at in perspective is, a snapshot in time, any one particular snapshot in time is not necessarily a good indicator of overall results, right? Or overall health and things like that. So although I look at the year over year change, I really try to pay attention to these long-term average changes because that appears to be a more realistic view of how things are trending over time. And, for the most part, those are all still favorable with some exceptions. But let's talk a little bit about sort of maybe why we're seeing the decline in a lot of species year over year, but then maybe contrast for us why we're still seeing really high percentages of long-term average for most species. But, you see, like, I'm looking at the results, for example, gadwall are up 43% over the long-term average. But then on the other side of that, pintails are down 40% over the long term. Right. And scaup are down 20% over the, long-term. And those are the two that seem to be really trending in the wrong direction. And then on the flip side, you get, pintail, limits kind of fluctuating and things like that and doing things that would kind of contradict that. So, I kind of balled like 10 questions into one, but maybe just kind of talk us through some of these numbers that we're seeing coming out and kind of help us dissect and sort of understand what we're looking at here.
Well, I mean, the thing about it is we've been riding a long wave of really high duck populations. And, you guys have a younger demographic than almost anybody in waterfowl. You're certainly way younger than we are. And you're way younger than the mean in terms of your listeners as a general rule. But, we've been riding liberal duck season since 1995. There's a big debate in the waterfowl management world here this summer. We've only had 7 years where the pond count has been below the LTA since 1993. I mean, it's been unprecedented wet, and we've had really good fortune, right? We had lots of CRP up until 2007. Since 2007, we've lost a lot of grass, but we've had really generally pretty wet conditions until the last couple of years, and we've lost red fox and big chunks of the prairie. So ducks have done really well. So, I think we've all been kind of kind of spoiled in terms of the breeding populations we've had. It doesn't always translate into what guys see over their decoys, but the breeding populations have been strong. The thing that really struck me when we got the report on Monday was how incredibly similar these numbers are. And if you look at the slope of the decline, if you look at the big status report the Fish and Wildlife Service puts out, and you look at the slope of the decline in ponds, and you look at the slope of the decline in ducks, they're inextricably linked. I mean, they're just the linkage is incredible. And so, we've had a couple of years here where we've been drier, but we've had these high duck numbers. Well, I think we just sort of worked our way through those surplus ducks, and this is the one where the drier conditions sort of got us. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it's hard to be too squirrely about 9.2 million mallards or 6.4 million blue-winged teal. We still got lots of ducks, but we certainly didn't have the kind of breeding conditions this year that was going to translate into lots of ducks settling in the best habitat, and probably is going to translate into incredible production.
So, one of my first questions when I saw this was, the pintail limit just went up this year, and now, the 18% decline and the long-term average is down 40, like Josh mentioned. Are we looking at next year? Is that going to go back down to 1, or is there any? Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because the pintail model for all 4 flyways is based on the pintail survey in the traditional survey area, which is the prairies up through the Boreal up to Alaska. And the other thing that happens is they also correct for a latitudinal adjustment. What we know about pintails is pintails are most productive when they're in the prairies. And so the further north they nest, we know the reproductive potential is lower. So therefore, that model is sensitive to latitude as well. So what you've got this year is you've got a pretty low number. And actually, guys, I got to be honest, you guys know Kyle Winterstein, and we did Frank Rohr and Kyle Winterstein, and our magazine editor Paul Wake got on the phone 2 weeks ago, and they just sort of wanted Frank and I to blue sky gaze about what we thought. And I'll admit this on the air, I predicted that we were going to have a bump up in pintails because the early reports was Alberta was really wet, the highline of Montana was really wet, and I was hopeful that, pintail move around so much, searching out that, that skinny water and that temporary and seasonal wetland community, that they'd find their way into those places. And you could see it. Interestingly enough, you could see it in Montana and the Western Dakota, especially in the Montana highline. But we didn't see it in Alberta the way I thought we should have. And with dry Saskatchewan, dry Eastern Dakotas, Manitoba doesn't matter a whole heck of a lot to pintail. But it was just overall the dry conditions just sort of swamped them. And I was brutally wrong on my pintail prediction.
I got to be honest with you. Where I hunt, we don't shoot a lot of pintail. So, we shoot them on occasion, but it's not a duck that I really, it's just not on my radar a ton. So, I don't hunt an area. I don't hunt an area where if there was a drastic decline, I wouldn't necessarily notice it that much in my little local region area that I hunt. But obviously there are guys that see tons of pintails and things. So these, bag limits that are changing and things, they're being quite impacted by these. I'm curious, and I know this is a game, an unknown, but in your opinion, what's the next species that's going to be like is there another species that's in danger of being the next pintail, or something that we're going to see out of the blue where they want to down the bag limit because for whatever reason this particular species is appearing to have struggles? Is there another one coming down the pipe that we can anticipate that might be kind of in a similar boat?
Well, I imagine we'll talk about eastern mallards, but I'll save my rant for that for a little bit. Okay. We've sort of been there with SCOP, right? We've been there with SCOP for a while. It doesn't appear as so. But guys, we just, when we'll talk about the Farm Bill too, but, if we can sort of, maintain the wetlands that we have now, and, we continue to lose lots of them in Prairie Canada, but if we can continue to, have the wetland base, I mean, I'm convinced, and Dr. Frank Rohr and I have a very vigorous running debate on what the problem with pintails is, and, I make the grand assertion that it's the loss of temporary and seasonal wetlands at, places like southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, and he makes the case that it's the loss of summer fallow, pintails nesting in stubble fields, and suffering high predation and getting whacked by the air seeder. And we're probably both right. He will say he's more right than I am, and I'll say I'm more right than he. But he's got a PhD, so you should probably listen to him. But unless we really go into a situation where we're losing lots of habitat, we seem to have plenty of habitat for blue wings and green wings and gadwall and spoonies and mallards. And so, but the key is, we can't take a big step backward. And frankly, that's probably the biggest task we have in the Farm Bill, is make sure we don't take that big step backward.
I'm looking over these numbers, and I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago that there was an article about the gadwall out, and I think they called it the super duck. And it just seemed like it was on a really vigorous climb of, just showing up everywhere and in great numbers. And really that's a shocking number, being down 31%. So they went from 4.18 to 2.89 this year. Is that all, wetlands too, or is there something else going on with the gadwall?
The gadwall are funny. I mean, if you look at gadwall numbers, I mean, we've got way more gadwalls than we had in 1955. And, the same can't be said for, certainly can't be said for pintail or scaup, right? And the gadwall, and one interesting thing about the gadwalls, if you looked at the drought in the late 80s and early 90s, when things were really grim and we got down to 5 million mallards and we had 3 bird bag limits, gadwall numbers actually increased through the heart of that drought. Just a little bit year over year, year over year, year over year, year over year. And the reason for that is gadwalls, unlike a species like pintail or redheads or blue-winged teal, are not as hyper-tied to those, and even mallards are not as hyper-tied to those small temporary and seasonal wetlands, the ones that we have a tendency to lose the most of. And so they can sort of make a go with it in drier conditions. The other benefit that the gadwall has is they nest a little bit later. And what we know about prairie nesting ducks is if you nest later, you have a higher chance of hatching your eggs because there's all sorts of, the grass is growing up. It's easier to be camouflaged from predators, but there's also a lot of other things on the landscape for predators to eat. And so, gadwall's sort of been the winning duck. And you can see it with spoonies, you can see it with blue wings too. They're all kind of in the same vein when it comes to being later nesters. They're the ones that are sort of winning. And CRP was a huge thing for gadwalls. You can just watch the gadwall populations pop when we rode that CRP wave. In terms of the number this year, it puzzles me a little bit. Because you think gadwall would be a duck we'd count pretty well in the survey. They don't overfly. They're a prairie nester. One thing that, folks have mentioned in the banter on Facebook and forums and stuff over the last, few weeks is, we did have some really bad weather in April, and it might have delayed the migration chronology a little bit. And maybe we're seeing that a little bit with gadwall. We may be seeing it with blue-winged teal too. Am I worried that gadwall are going to go in the tank? No, because they're gadwall. They just find a way to get it done.
I'm looking over these numbers and I'm comparing a little bit the overall survey, and then I'm contrasting that against the Eastern survey. And man, there's a lot of red arrows pointing down on that Eastern survey. And as a guy hunting in the Atlantic flyway, that makes me worried. And one thing that I do kind of that's catching my eye here is that for the longest time I read about that the ringneck was if not the top, but it was one of the top, most populated duck in our flyway. And I could certainly attest to that. See a ton of ringnecks. But now the survey numbers are showing, black ducks outnumber the ringnecks in the eastern count. And, we're seeing a bump in our black duck, in our black duck bag limit. What is the black duck doing that mallards, for example, aren't doing, that's allowing it to, kind of build and, allow us to have greater bag limits where, we're seeing other ducks kind of go in the other direction?
Well, don't be confused about why you got a bump in your black duck bag limit. It doesn't have diddly squat to do with black ducks. It has everything to do with mathematics. And so when they ran the first black duck model, they assumed that the harvest rate on black ducks was going to be similar to what it was on mallards. And I'll give a lot of credit to the Atlantic Flyway and the Fish and Wildlife Service. They went back and started looking at what their projected harvest rates were versus their actual harvest rates. It's part of, the sort of normal peek in at regulations to see how these models are performing. And, the mathematics involved in this, guys, is dizzying. And I can't even hope to explain it other to say it's dizzying in models. They're supposed to be predictive. And the good news with our models is, we've got, relatively good data. And I think generally the models perform pretty well. But so it didn't have anything to do, I kept hearing about the black duck decrease last year, and I kept looking at the numbers and said, there's no way. I looked back at the model, I looked at what the predicted regulatory alternatives were with this population, that population, said, there's no way. Well, that's because it doesn't have anything to do with the number of black ducks. It has a lot to do with how few black ducks we're actually killing. And so when you start looking at the models, the harvest rates for, take an adult male black duck. So the way we should be running and like to run harvest models is you break the population into 4 cohorts. So you have adult males, adult females, juvenile females. And all 4 of those cohorts have different survival rates. We know juveniles make more bad mistakes and end up in the stew pot more than adults do. And especially when you look at mid-continent mallards, there's an incredible amount of resilience. There's, a fair bit of clarity in that data. And with black ducks, I think the predicted harvest rate, again, guys, I'm a little bit out of my bandwidth. So any of your listeners don't, you tie the noose for me. But my recollection is the predicted harvest rate on adult male black ducks is somewhere up around 12%, when in actuality, it's about 5%. And so what they did is they looked at these models and said, well, we can jump up the bag limit and still be well below what our predicted harvest rates were at our point. And so that's how you got more black ducks. It doesn't have anything to do that there's more black ducks on the planet. It's a math. It all boils down to mathematics and allowable take based on the models.
Interesting.
Because actually black ducks, eastern mallards are down 15% below the LTA, and black ducks are 20% below the LTA. So actually black ducks, relative to the long-term average, at least the long-term average that we used for decision-making, which in the eastern survey area goes back to the early 90s, black ducks are still below the LTA, worse than mallards.
So with all this harvest rate talk, it just takes me back to a question, and you see it online all the time when guys are asking, well, they say that hunters have zero impact on population, so why do you see the varying bag limits? So the pintail, goes down, it was down, then went up, and now we're seeing a decline, so it's going to go back down. But you guys do calculate the harvest rate, so there is a little bit of hunter interaction going into the actual formula, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they've got all sorts of data. So the banding data is where you really calculate the survival rates. And the challenge, the good news with managing ducks is we've got lots of data. I mean, we talked about the traditional survey. And, you guys mentioned that, how much can you trust it year over year? And that's an appropriate characterization. It's not a census, for goodness sakes. There's nobody showing up at every duck's pothole and saying, how many of you live here, right? But it's really a good index. And it's I think anybody on the planet would recognize, I would guess that the North American-wide breeding survey for ducks, well, let's stay with the traditional survey area, where we have data going back to 1955, collected in a sound, rigorous way. I bet you that's better than the white-tailed deer survey that the North Dakota Game and Fish conducts in terms of its precision in measuring. So it's an incredible census. But if you look at the numbers, guys, and it's the same with everything. So you have error bars around what our breeding population estimates are. You have error bars around what our survival rate estimates are. We have error bars around what the age ratios are. So none of this stuff, it isn't like building a space shuttle to a micrometer tolerance. We've got slop in the data, and that's I think that's one of the things that hunters can look at waterfowl management, especially in harvest management, and say, these guys have, we can kind of all fool ourselves into believing we have this incredible control and precision with the decisions we make. And I remember when I was just got started at Delta and trying to learn everything I could from all the smart people in the waterfowl world. And Dr. John Eady is the Raveling faculty member at University of California, Davis, one of brilliant waterfowl mind, and a wonderfully delightful guy, and was willing to talk to a non-biologist like me who really didn't know a damn thing when I got started. And John, we were talking about harvest, and John said, we manage harvest like we're driving a Maserati down an Italian highway, mountain highway, when in reality we're driving an 18-wheeler across Kansas. And that's really accurate. And so, I think, from my perspective, in the longer I've been around, the more we pretend to have this incredible control and precision around managing harvest, I'm just less and less moved by it all the time, just because I'm aware of the slop in the models. I'm aware of slop in the data. And I also know that, I think part of the reason why you guys can shoot more black ducks in the Atlantic Flyway now is because you have fewer hunters. There's fewer guns. There's not as many Model 12s and 1100, not as many Super Black Eagles and Bred A400 there was Model 12s and 1100s and A5s 20 years ago. And that's probably got as much to do with the harvest rate declining as anything else.
Yeah.
And so all those variables determine, if we get a mild winter or a cold winter, that has a pretty significant impact on the number of birds we kill. And so how can you control for that in these models? It's really hard.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy thing. And, first that's what kind of worries me a little bit about these surveys. And, we get these snapshots in time, and you see a lot of data that, you may not know a lot about, and people start, it's people's tendency to want to overreact and kind of, draw conclusions that, may be slightly unfounded based on just what this information says. And I think, for whatever reason, duck numbers and bag limits and stuff is a very polarizing topic. And we've learned that firsthand with, the Eastern mallard situation that has come up. And, certainly, Delta has taken a stance on that. So maybe just before we get into that, as far as, Delta's stance on what's being proposed and things like that, for anybody that doesn't know, and just so that there's no sort of misinformation amongst our listenership, talk to us a little bit about how we got here with the mallards in the eastern portion of the country, Atlantic Flyway, and sort of what has led up to this, this proposal for next year that, limits the bag limit in half, essentially.
Yeah, well, the thing about it is if you looked at a graph at eastern mallards, you just see this sort of drip decline that's been happening for quite some time. And And the decline, interestingly, is more acute in the northeastern United States than it is up in the Canadian portion of the eastern survey. That was flipped this year. This year, the northeastern U.S. went up a little bit, and sort of the Canadian areas went down a little bit. But so it's been sort of a persistent, nagging problem. And, and I'll give credit where credit is due is, the Atlantic Flyway's been cognizant of this, and they've been really worried about it because, the way duck regulations have been set in the Atlantic Flyway before this year, and the way they're set in the interior two flyways and the mid-continent mallard drives, regulations in the Central and Mississippi Flyway, and then the Western mallard model now drives the general duck season in the Pacific Flyway. So the mallard has been sort of the bellwether for setting regulations. And with that decline, we were getting dangerously close. Believe it or not, guys, to having to close the duck season in the Atlantic Flyway based on the decline of eastern mallards. And so, a lot of good work by, the Atlantic Flyway states and the Fish and Wildlife Service sort of came up with a new sort of framework for decision making where they're going to what they're referring to as a multi-stock model, which incorporates the ducks that make up the bulk of the harvest in the Atlantic Flyway. So that's ringnecks, wood ducks, green-winged teal, and golden eyes, which is startling to me, but whatever. And so those are the four ducks they picked to build a model. But what that allows them to do is allows them to keep the general duck season as it is and as it has been, which is a 60-day, six-bird bag. But unfortunately, they're constrained by this mallard population objective, which is a policy objective that says we need to maintain a long-term abundance of X. And see, the challenge is because these birds are managed under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and you have people out there that don't necessarily like hunting. If the Fish and Wildlife maintain liberal seasons based on mallards when it says they should have a closed season, before you can call a $6 an hour lawyer, somebody's going to file an injunction. And so that's the sort of jam that everybody got into, is the mallard was driving the models. The mallard was getting very close to the point where we'd have to close seasons, which I think we can all agree is a really horrible outcome for everybody. And they pivoted, did good work to create the multi-stock model, but they still have to deal with this policy problem. Again, it's a policy problem about what the long-term objective is for mallard populations, and then had to find a way to reduce harvest rates based on the models that could get them, they could show a good faith effort to get back to that objective. So I hope that wasn't too technical, but if we need to clarify it, I'll happily go back.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and really the worrisome part of what you mentioned is that the only duck that is above the long-term average is the merganser in the Eastern Survey. So when you're, even when you talk about having four ducks that you're referencing, they're all down. So, I'm on our Delta committee here, and it makes me think, why are all these duck numbers going down, and what can we do, in our committee, or, is there anything that we are able to do to help those numbers?
Well, I think, remember, if you look at the interesting thing is, and you guys, we've talked about the Eastern Survey area before when I've been on the show, the difference between the prairies and the Eastern Survey area is the Eastern Survey area tends to be quite a bit more temperate. The average and the mean tend to be something out there. So you don't get the sort of drought and deluge that we get in the prairies. But if you compare and contrast, the Fish and Wildlife Service and Status Report puts out, I think, what is a wonderful map. And it's not it's not empirical like the napalm counts, but what it does is it shows the year-over-year change in habitat conditions as assessed by the pilot biologists. And God, last year, you guys, I mean, almost all of Ontario and Quebec, and Labrador was in excellent condition. And this year it came back a little bit towards the mean. And actually some of those areas up in the far northern areas were rated as poor. So, I mean, the other thing about it is, again, the Eastern Survey area, part of the challenge with it is, and especially when you compare it with the traditional survey areas, you just don't have the depth of data, right? And your population sizes are a lot smaller. I mean, the population of Eastern mallards is, touch over 1 million, where the mid-continent population is 900,000. And so, if there's one place not to get worried about annual variation, from my vantage point, it's the Eastern Survey area, because you don't have the strength in the data to suggest that, the road's going to hell in a handbasket year over year out there. You just don't have the strength in the data to say that, I don't think.
So we find ourselves now in this position, though, where they want to cut the bag limit in half for the 19 and 20 season, but they still will allow two hen mallards to be harvested, which, I mean, conventional wisdom would tell you that, taking it easy on the Susie would make a lot more sense if you're trying to have more ducks. But yet they're not going to change that regulation at all. So a guy can go out and shoot two hens and fill his bag limit that way. That seems to me to be counterintuitive to what they're trying to do. If they're trying to, get more, have more ducks in the sky, seems like, taking it easy on the Susie would be a better course of action.
Well, in just as a point of clarification, they may end up there. The Atlantic Flyway is holding their meeting. The technical and flyway meeting are the last week in September. I'm going to be there. I'm expecting it'll be a really interesting meeting. And lots of really good, dedicated professionals in that flyway that I think will do a really nice job. But so they may end up dropping the female limit to 1. So here's the problem, guys. Here's the problem as it's been explained to me. Let me back up. And so let's talk about the decline for just one more minute. So I kind of gave you the policy rationale and the regulation rationale. Let's talk about the duck. The duck is declining. When I first heard about this move, I thought, well, something isn't making any sense. The thing that really is confounding about Eastern mallards is we look at three things that we can give us a glimpse of how populations are faring. We can look at the breeding population number, which we do, and which we're talking about tonight. And we look at survival estimates from the banded sample. And we could look at age ratios in the harvest. And what the age ratios tell us is production increasing, decreasing, or stable over time. So if I would walk you guys through, take a species like pintail or lesser scaup, what you will see is you can watch that decline, and you can marry that decline with the declining number of juveniles in the fall flight. So fewer young, fewer young, fewer young, fewer young, right? And we all know populations are driven by births and deaths. If you die faster than you have babies, your population goes down. And that's what's happening with pintails and scaup. Here's the confounding problem with Eastern mallards. The population is going down, the age ratios have not declined, and survival has not declined. So it gets you into one of these things doesn't belong here, right? Going back to Sesame Street. And when I first heard about this, and I heard about the age ratios, and I heard about the survival, I thought, well, I wonder if there's a bias in their survey, which there still may be, by the way. And nobody's necessarily ruling out that may well be the case. And especially, again, the survey is relatively new. It's a lot harder to count ducks in the northeastern United States and eastern Canada than it is flying around in an airplane in North Dakota. I guarantee you that. And the other thing is the breeding densities of ducks in the east are so much lower. I mean, I can take you guys in a wet year to, place in southeastern North Dakota where there's 100 breeding pairs of ducks per square mile. There'll probably be 25 to 30 pairs of mallards per square mile. Hell, most areas in eastern breeding grounds, you'd almost never get to one breeding pair per square mile. So the ability to detect it, you could have all sorts of problems with your survey, but there's a nifty little mathematical deal called a Lincoln estimator that Dr. Todd Arnold at the University of Minnesota and Dr. Ray Alasaskis at the University of Saskatchewan have used primarily with light geese, and they can apply it to ducks, and they can do sort of a surrogate means of assessing population size. I was able to dig that up, and I looked at it. Well, the absolute value and the numbers are different, but the trend of the decline is the same. So we've got this big problem, and one of these things doesn't belong here. So going back to your question about hen mallards, so when they run the model, what I'm hearing from the folks that are in the know, good people and they're smart people, is that they don't have enough confidence in their models to tease out the difference between the four cohorts. Remember the four cohorts we just talked about with black ducks? Mm-hmm. Adult males, adult females, juvenile males, juvenile females. They don't feel like they have enough precision in their data to tease it out. So what we know is in the Atlantic flyway is very few guys are killing 4 mallards a day. Very few guys are killing 3 mallards a day. And they're probably, this is a wild-ass guess, but the average take of mallard hens per hunter day is probably about a quarter of a Susie per hunt effort. Now, again, guys, that's a wild-ass guess, but you'll kind of get where I'm going. So if you cut the overall bag limit, that is the way to reduce your female harvest. Okay? So that is, again, they're concerned that they don't have the precision in their data to make the inferences down to those cohort scales. Now, John Devney, being a fairly simple guy who couldn't run these models with 47 engineers in my office, I look at it and say, who cares about that level of precision? Remember, we're driving an 18-wheeler across the Kansas, across the freeway in Kansas, not a Maserati down a mountain road. Do we evaluate? And this has been the case that Delta's made, is we'd be irresponsible, I think, to suggest that there isn't a decline. There's a decline. I don't know if nobody knows precisely why. There's some speculation about precisely the slope of that decline, but there's a decline. We recognize the Fish and Wildlife Service has trust responsibilities to manage that resource over the long term. So our argument was, before you invoke the 50% reduction in the mallard limit, why would you not evaluate a 3-in-1 as potentially a way to get you to the same survival rate? And the one thing I will say is, if you're going to they're going to show up at that flyway meeting, and I think there's going to be a good number of state biologists. They're going to show up and say, well, Delta really pissed us off, but they got a point on this one mallard thing. And hunters are hammering. Even the hunters that are supportive of reducing down to 2, I think, are saying, why in the hell are you going to let us shoot 2? So there's going to be biologists that I think are going to make the strong argument that we should go to 1. However, I think you're going to have biologists from Maine, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, especially the northern zones of New York and Pennsylvania, where now you're going to turn the bag limit into a 1 duck bag limit. And I don't think those states, if the model doesn't say they have to go to 1, I think those northern states, I'm guessing, nobody's told me this, but if I was a duck biologist from New York, I'd say there's no way I'm going to put my hunters out in the field for 60 days for 1 duck. Yeah. And so it's going to be, I think you're going to see a geographic fight over hen mallards. Again, nobody's told me that. I'm not operating on inside information. I'm just guessing that that's going to be an argument. because I think, if you're opening your duck season, I don't know when those seasons open, but they open in late September, early October. There's still a lot of brown ducks out there. It's going to be really hard very different for the guy to discern between a hen or a drake in late September in the northern, in the Finger Lakes than it is for the guy in the low country of South Carolina.
Yeah, we definitely have the half brown headed Drake mallards quite often in the early season here, so that makes a lot of sense. And especially here, because I think we get more cloudy days than sunny days. So when everything's drab looking like that, it's really it's the ID becomes a little more difficult when you're talking like that. But going back, so answer me this: how are they getting that data? Is it all from banding? Is it from, and I'm going, the harvest data? Is it banding? Is it the wing clipping surveys that they put out?
No, it's banding. People grouse about the HIP surveys that, everybody lies on the HIP surveys. Well, of course everybody lies. I don't lie on the HIP surveys. You guys are probably too honorable to lie on the HIP surveys. But the HIP surveys, how many ducks did you kill last year? That just puts you into a clump of hunters for surveying purposes. And so when they're doing the wing survey, they have to pull guys from each sort of population of duck hunters, the Billy Badass duck hunters, the not so Billy Badass duck hunters, and the total topwaters, and they batch them together. And that's how they sample to get, sort of the duck harvest estimates in the state, in the sex ratios and the age ratios. But that doesn't have any bearing on survival. That all comes out of the banded sample. And I'll give the service and the flyways credit. They've done a good job at having good, robust banding programs. And they've corrected, we've changed the banding reporting a lot over the years. It used to be the mail-in, and then it was the call-in, and now it's online. But, the service through award band programs, they can do, in the flyways, have done a really good job teasing out what the non-response bias is. Those, they're not perfect, but they're pretty darn good harvest estimates when it comes to the banded sample.
So when they're talking about dropping these bag limits and, all of these things, and they have these arguments behind closed doors, when these people are presenting their arguments, at what point do they does anybody point out the fact that, well, if you drop the bag limit to one duck, people aren't going to hunt and people aren't going to buy duck stamps, and they're not going to go out, and we're going to lose recruitment and all of these things. I mean, do they consider the ripple effect of a decision like that, or is it purely just the math and the numbers and the models and all of that?
I think option B. I think it's way more option B. It's about math and models. And, I'm not saying people are ignorant or, sort of ignoring those facts, but I mean, that's where they're spending most of their time. They're thinking about those mathematical models. And again, remember, so the Fish and Wildlife Service sort of outlines, again, they've got a legal authority to manage these birds. They set the population objectives. That's not just done by the service. That's a partnership process. But, those numbers have to mean something. And so there's a point at which I think people are compelled to action. And I'm not going to dismiss the Fish and Wildlife Service for that. I'm not going to dismiss the work the Atlantic Flyway's done in that regard. I think people are now talking about, I think one of the big topics at the Atlantic Flyway meeting is going back and reevaluating what those population objectives should be for eastern mallards. Because, by the way, the eastern mallard was never really a thing.
Right.
They're immigrants, man. They're not quite as bad as a ringneck pheasant in our part of the world, but there's certainly, they've immigrated there and they did really well. And, there's some speculation that, they came in, they did well, just as a new species does in an environment where it can. And now they're sort of coming back to the mean. The problem, we can't measure that. We've only been counting the mallard there since 1991. If we were counting the mallard since 1955, I bet you we wouldn't be below the long-term average.
Right.
So, but again, they're compelled legally to do something. And so, the point we've been trying to make is, we recognize your back's against the wall. We're not going to dismiss that. We understand it. We appreciate it. But we need, can we compel you to think about this problem in a different way, and in a way that we think has, as good a chance to recover the population as any, and probably does less harm to duck hunting in the same way at the same time. Again, I don't have their models at my fingertips. And even if I did, it'd be like putting a monkey in charge of the space shuttle. But we certainly would have liked to have had that regulatory alternative explored vigorously before we do something as drastic as reduce the mallard limit by 50%.
So I'm just listening to you and thinking about this. How it seems like they have a job to do, to keep the resource above the long-term average or close to it. And the buck stops with them pretty much. So if it needs to be done, if they need to shut it down, then they're going to shut it down. So how much influence do people outside like Delta have by going to these meetings and giving them alternative ideas?
Well, let me just back up for a point for just a minute. When we were at we're not done yet. I mean, I'm not flying to Massachusetts for my health. I can guarantee you that for this flywheel meeting. And believe me, my guess is I'll probably get a room next to the communal bathroom or something, because not everybody's pleased with me. And Delta kind of weighed in to, I'll either be next to the boiler or the communal crap, or one of the two. But I made the point that if you have so much confidence in your models, tell me how many years of this prescriptive action it's going to take to recover eastern mallards. Well, there's no answer. Right? I'll admit that question's pretty mean-spirited. But, if we believe in our math, are we all in on the math, or are we not all in on the math, is my point.
Well, that makes so much sense, because if you're going to make decisions solely based on the matrices of these models, how can you not game it out to see what that decision is going to render out on the back end?
What they will come back with is exactly what I let in with 10 minutes ago, is that we don't have any control, right? It could be wet on the breeding grounds. It could be dry. It could be cold. So that's fine. All that's well and good, but it kind of makes my point that we're driving an 18-wheeler across the freeway in Kansas. We're not driving a Maserati down an Italian mountain road. And so here's what I know. Here's what I think I know. I don't know much. Here's what I think I know, is that I'm pretty confident eastern mallards aren't going to go extinct on my watch. I'm quite confident, although not mathematically so, that a 3-in-1 at least has the potential to reduce harvest rates on females, which is what matters, enough to help recover the population. Now, note what I said there. I believe that's a fairly qualified answer. But what I do know is eastern mallards aren't going to go extinct. Probably aren't going to go extinct well, they're certainly not going to go extinct even if we didn't change regulations. Now, extinction should never be our objective function, right? So that's not nice. But, it isn't like, from my opinion, I think what's happening, duck hunters are getting sort of whipsawed by this, from 4 to 2. And I think, guys, I mean, your listener base is engaged. They're, on Facebook, they're following your shows. I would hazard a guess that 60+% of Atlantic flyway duck hunters have no idea that this is coming down the pike. Now, you guys may think I'm crazy because you guys are younger and well-connected and paying attention to stuff. I would be not shocked in my life if 65% of Atlantic flyway hunters had no idea that this final decision is going to be made in September. And I think people are going to freak out, just like people freaked out in your networks that have been hearing about this for the last several months. And I think it's going to cause a lot of people to rethink about what they're going to do on duck season. And if you look at, in fairness to, to everybody involved, if you look at the numbers and just look at the kill, the mallard kill in the Atlantic flyway relative to other ducks isn't just heads and shoulders above it like it would be in the Central or Mississippi or even Pacific. There's kind of a bunch of ducks jammed in kind of at the top there. And so you can look at that and say, well, mallards aren't that important to Atlantic flyway hunters. Well, until you ask them. That was the one thing that when we did our survey, we heard, mallards just aren't that important in our bag. Well, if you look at empirically, that's true. But if you ask the hunter says, yeah, they're damn important. And I think that was sort of one of the things from the survey that we did, which, guys, is not without its faults. It was quick and dirty, and it's got an avidity bias. The guys that we're surveying shoot a hell of a lot more ducks than the average Atlantic flyway duck hunter. It's got all sorts of problems. But I think directionally it's sound. Guys said, yeah, mallards are really important to me. Now what that may mean is, and I think it means in the Atlantic flyway is, yeah, mallards are really important to me because I dream that every morning when I get up, I'm going to shoot 4 and I might shoot 1. Mm-hmm. But they're dreaming about shooting 4. And I think that's one of the things we don't account for in harvest management in dealing with duck hunters. It's not necessarily the pile of dead ducks at their feet. It's a pile of dead ducks they see in their head when they're driving in the dark. That's what gets them up. It's aspirational. And I think that may be one of the things we're missing in this conversation about eastern mallards is, you look at it and say, well, the average guy only kills, a couple mallards per day. Well, you said 2 mallards. There's a few guys that do shoot 4 a day. They're going to miss them. And there are a bunch of guys that may only shoot 2. But boy, I tell you, they ain't putting long johns on and breaking ice to hopefully shoot 1.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely something that, a lot of our listeners have been tracking, and we've gotten a lot of emails and people weighing in on it. So I'm anxious to see what happens in September and kind of what happens moving forward with all of that. But I did want to shift gears here again one more time and talk a little bit about geese. And, we've talked about this before, but it just seems like, no matter what efforts are made, some of these snow goose populations are just not, they just continue to increase year over year, regardless of liberal limits and unplugged shotguns and all of these other things that they've done to try. What's it like in the room when this part of the discussion comes up, where it's a bird that is far exceeding its growth limits, and despite every effort, the population doesn't seem to come into control?
Well, I mean, the thing about it is when you start talking about, Arctic nesting geese, and, that's speckle bellies, it's white fronts, it's your guys' APs, those geese that nest at really high latitudes. The thing that's changed for those geese over time, I think, is that they survive at much higher rates than they used to. Imagine what it was like for a snow goose at the turn of the century without, grain once it cleared the trees in a place like Saskatchewan. It was just trees and grass and grass and grass and grass. Mm. And, you're a young snow goose and, I don't know how the hell those things made a living before agriculture. And now they come off the Arctic breeding grounds. They clear the last line of pines. And then it's food from, the bush all the way to the Gulf or all the way to your part of the world, depending on which goose populations, migratory pathway they're taking. And so I think very different than ducks, the historic bottleneck for goose populations has been overwinter survival. And we've just totally uncorked that. They're just, is there some mortality? Yeah, and you get some disease outbreaks here and there. But they're much fitter. They're much further fitting in the fall migration and much more fit physiologically in the spring when they're migrating. And the world today with Arctic nesting geese is governed by damn near only one thing, and that's weather. And if you have an early ice out, you have a nice, mild breeding season, you're going to have great recruitment. This year, a lot of the populations of mid-continent geese, the population estimates are high, but I'm hearing about total busts in recruitment from certain areas of the Arctic, the snow goose breeding range. There's colonies that, they couldn't find juveniles to band. And that's very common. Last year was the exact opposite. I have never in my life seen more young, dumb snow geese than we had here last fall. It was insane. Absolutely insane. There were 1,200 bird shoots down near the South Dakota border for 10, 15 days straight.
Wow.
I was in on a 247 bird shoot. What was it? 208. We shot 287 geese. Of those 287 geese, 6 of them were adults.
Holy smokes.
And boy, did those things make bad mistake after bad mistake. And so, but this year it's going to be very different. This year it's going to be different. Now, you still got those 2-year-olds that still make plenty of mistakes, but we're not going to have those fresh snow geese off the tundra wandering around into silicox spreads like they did last year. And that's the only thing that's limiting most populations, Mother Nature on testing. And the other thing is when I started at Delta in the late 90s was sort of in the the crescendo of the Arctic goose crisis, and they were going to eat themselves out of house and home. And we've all seen the photographs, right, of the exclosure with the only green grass and it's a sea of mud. But here's the thing. They're pretty damn industrious, and those geese are finding a way to make a living, and they're moving around in this sort of ecological collapse that we thought we were going to have on the tundra. Just hasn't happened. Now, are there areas that have been damaged? Sure there are. But the sort of cascade, the ecological cascade of, the whole Arctic is going to be totally destroyed by this marauding band of Arctic geese. It just really hasn't played out.
So have you, you're talking about migration a little bit. Have you seen any movement into migration? You hear a lot, and just referencing Facebook a lot more, but people were saying it's moving east as far as, the snows and speckle bellies. we're still not, we might see one group of specks every 5 or 6 years, but that's about all we see here. But the snows, are they coming this way a little bit more?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, well, you guys are dealing with your own, you're dealing with that, almost all white population that's a different bunch of geese, snow geese that you guys are shooting. But, but that population's doing really well too. And when you talk about mid-continent snow geese and you talk about the white front is a fascinating one because, I'm talking to guys in Minnesota that are seeing white fronts more and more frequently in Iowa. And we've seen it here. I mean, I've gone to the point where I went and bought a half dozen speckled belly floaters because one of my favorite marshes was getting to the point where if a guy had a yodeler and 6 floaters, you could probably shoot your 2 white fronts every day. That was completely unheard of when I first moved here 20 years ago. And I mean, the white fronts had stopped at Swift Current, Saskatchewan, where they stage in incredible numbers, and they blow over this place in about 5 nights. And it's an amazing thing, guys, because I can literally listen to them in mid-October. I just happened to be on the sort of Speckle Valley Superhighway, the way they kind of kitty corner cut the Missouri River, fly right over my house. And I can talk to friends of mine in southwest Louisiana. They're there a day or two from when they come up to my house. It's an incredible migration. And they just didn't stop here. The other thing that I've seen in my lifetime is 20 years ago, we'd have 8 gajillion of those little itty bitty short neck Canadas around early in October. And I mean, and they were wonderful. They're a nice goose to eat, and they were dumber than stumps, and you could wail on them pretty good. And there was, all around a pretty nice critter to have around. I can't tell you the last good little Canada hunt I've had. And a lot of that is they're doing what the snow geese are doing, which is hanging out in the Canadian prairies where there's lots of food and not much hunting pressure. And then when they move, they tend to move late. And it seems like the little Canadas are moving a little further east as well. And it's not, it's not Wisconsin, but it's the eastern part of North Dakota where they used to really come through these big lakes in central North Dakota. They just don't seem to get them anymore, right? Very familiar with the piece of property about 45 miles east of here where, he used to hold, just absolute gajillion of those little Canadas. And I bet you he's down to killing a half dozen a year where, I bet you that used to make up 75% of his goose harvest was on those little Canadas.
Yeah,
so they're definitely shifting around.
Yeah, it's amazing to me to think about just all of this whole discussion that we've had. It wasn't that long ago that they had a moratorium on Canada geese in Maryland, and on the Eastern Shore and stuff. And people, sometimes forget about that. And, you see birds now and I go there and I'm like, holy cow, it's like every field I see is just loaded with Canada geese. But there's only a 2-bird limit. And, there's just so much that goes into all of that. And I'm looking through these survey numbers and stuff, and it's showing snow geese increasing in the mid-continent, and the, let's see here, the flock that, we hunt here, kind of the greater snow, the Jersey to North Carolina kind of migration area there is up 17%, so you're seeing all this just incredible growth. The one that you kind of hear about all the time that's not thriving and is kind of struggling to gain any traction is Brant. And, I'm looking at these and it seems like it's both the Pacific Brant and the Atlantic Brant, population struggle. And I think that's probably a bird that not a lot of people talk about, but, kind of what are the problems, that are plaguing that particular species of goose there?
Okay. You officially got me. I won't even render opinion on Brant. I don't know if I've actually ever seen one. And, whatever I said about Brant should be dismissed by a 3rd grader. I literally know nothing about Brant.
Well, the funny thing about Brand, it seems like I don't know anything about them either. But it seems like every time I see somebody hunt them and they shoot them, they're all like double banded. It seems like, they get this like crazy banding done on these Brand. But I'm noticing this, and it's just, and I'm reading this. This is an article on Delta if anybody's interested. It's talking about, although the Atlantic Brant has climbed a little bit the last couple years, it's 1% above its 10-year average in terrible breeding grounds and conditions in 2018. So not looking good, on that front. But then also in the Pacific Flyway, the Pacific Brant declined 21% and is 3 years below the 10-year average. So it's interesting to just see all the subspecies and how they just vary as far as their success and their growth. And Brant's just one that you just kind of see kind of on the side, but they're cool. The one thing I don't know as much about the Atlantic Brant. I know guys that have committed their lives. You take Chris Nicolai in Nevada. Chris has done a lot of great research, but I mean, Chris has been on the very edge with Jim Sedinger and some other folks. They've got a marked sample of Pacific Brant that, I mean, they've almost got those suckers named. It's not quite Cecil the Lion, but it's close. And they've just been working up there so long, and they've got such a good, and that's the difference between, these relatively geographically small goose populations and duck populations is because, they've got incredible fidelity, and they've got just, I mean, I don't know, I think Chris listens to your show and follows your Facebook page. He can probably tell you what percentage of those birds they have marked. But, we have a fraction of mid-continent, teeny tiny fraction of mid-continent mallards banded. You've got a gajillion bands on those. Mm-hmm. And they can do some really cool stuff. Start talking about modeling. When they're all Cecil the Lion or Leo the Lion, you can do some pretty cool stuff mathematically with them, all of which is totally beyond my ability to understand.
I think it'd be pretty interesting just to see the models and the mathematics that goes into all that. Because this, even talking to you on a high level, is very eye-opening on how they come up with these numbers and the harvest rates and everything. And I apologize, I'm out of breath. I had to go turn my air compressor off. So that's what that rumbling was there for a little bit. But
no, but it's dizzying. And here's the thing. I think one of the things that, I think a number of folks, and I just for folks that haven't heard me on the radio, I'm pretty conservative when it comes to harvest. I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s in a duck drought. So I'm far more conservative than lots of folks when it comes to harvest management. But, I've gotten to the point where, I look at this stuff and think, man, what are we doing it for? Why, you guys, these models are dizzying. And I wonder if we're killing flies with sledgehammers all the time. And I sat next to Dr. Lee Fredrickson, who you guys may or may not have heard of, but I had the pleasure of sitting next to him at a lunch at the North American Duck Symposium in Memphis a number of years ago. And I asked, I said, Dr. Fredrickson, I introduced myself. And he says, well, first, don't call me Dr. Fredrickson. I said, well, tough shit. I'm going to call you Dr. Fredrickson. I'm not calling you Lee. And, he's been in the waterfowl world for a gazillion years, published a million papers. And I just said, Dr. Fredrickson, what do you think about the state of waterfowl science now? And he says, I don't understand any of the math.
Jeez.
Now I'm just a, moron duck hunter policy guy, right? So nobody should expect me to understand the math. But, here's a smart guy that's been in the field for a long time that just is overwhelmed by the mathematics. And listen, I'm not going to dismiss mathematics. Mathematics run our world in a lot of different ways. And listen, the power of these models is really, it's really impressive. Boy, oh boy, it just seems like a lot, especially, going back to the point I made a couple times earlier, that it's not like we've got this incredible control and precision, right? We're not, I mean, we could get really wet on the prairies next year and mallard populations can go up 25%. And it isn't because we didn't shoot any. It's because we've got 25%, we got some number of ducks that were outside of the survey area when we counted them this year that will respond to the favorable habitat condition and come back into the survey area. And so the ability to measure with precision, the implication of harvest, it's really hard. And as long as we set reasonable objectives and reasonable bag limits and reasonable seasons, with very few exceptions, canvasbacks are pretty sensitive to harvest. Sea ducks are pretty sensitive to harvest. Yeah, Arctic nesting geese, like your AP geese, you can shoot those down like they did years ago. But with pretty rare exceptions of things that I think are going to be limited by the gun. If we're reasonable, no market gunning, no live decoys, no night shooting, and that sort of stuff. I think, we're just in a period of the other sort of fascinating thing, guys, is if you looked at the trend in mallard harvest related to mallard populations are walking away from each other. Mallard populations continue to be doing relatively well, and our mallard harvest is declining. And again, I think that's just because we have fewer guns in the marsh. And the guns we have in the marsh are older and are hunting less.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. And, it's something we talk about a good deal on getting new people exposed to the sport and trying to, help with recruitment, not only, young folks, but, people in midlife that just have never had a chance to get out into the duck marsh. We've, definitely encouraged that. And, I think this has been a really good conversation, and a lot of guys probably, didn't know a lot of the information or, just see the numbers and don't really know what to make of it. And so I'm glad that we took the time to do that and go through that with you. And I'm sitting here looking at the clock, and it's 11:40 p.m. Eastern time here on Saturday night. And I'm sure Dan, after
we're a fun bunch, aren't we? Don't we have anything better to do?
I was gonna say, I can talk about this stuff all night. I mean, I love this stuff, and I just want to respect for your time, but I want everyone to be aware that if you go to the Delta Waterfowl webpage, for anyone that doesn't know, if you click hover over the media tab at the top of the page and go down to news, they've got several articles down there detailing kind of all the survey numbers and kind of what's going on with all of those things. So if you want to find out more information about any of this stuff, you can certainly go there and get good information. And, obviously we encourage everybody to get involved with their local Delta chapters and all that kind of stuff as well. So, Dan, you got anything else you want to ask John here before we let him go? I know he's had a long day, and I feel bad we've kept him as long as we have, but you got one more thing for him before we let him go?
my one more thing. No, we didn't really talk about the farm bill, and I'm sure that could be another hour conversation, but like you said, we're an hour 20 in, and we love having you on and appreciate it. It was a last minute request today, and definitely got a lot of good information out to our listeners. So we appreciate it, and I can't wait to have you on again.
Yeah, we can talk about short strokes on the farm bill. The House and Senate both passed bills. The Senate in a very bipartisan way. The House on a party line vote with a fair few Republicans defecting. I think it passed with 0 seconds on the clock with 2 votes. So pretty contentious on the House side. So they're moving into conference. The staff have been working really hard from the 4 corners, 2 in the Senate, 2 in the House. They've been doing good work to try to get the resolution. They're actually sitting down with the members on September the 5th to start moving towards a conference report by September 30th. The current farm bill expires on September 30th. That seems like, there's some pretty significant discrepancies between the House and Senate bill. Frankly, doesn't have much to do with the stuff that we work on. It's in the nutrition title, which is where the heat and the angst and the anger and frustration and some of that stuff is emerging. If you asked me to bet $1 million that we'd get a farm bill done by September 30th, I don't think I'd make $1 million bet on that. But Mitch McConnell's committed to making that happen. That certainly helps to have leadership that's pushing in that direction. Here's the big challenge, guys. This is one of these that make me a little bit crazy because we've been working on the Farm Bill for 2.5 years now. So if they don't pass the Farm Bill on September 30th, they can extend it, which we all know that's been more the case in Washington, D.C. the last few years than anything else. You kick the can down the road. You can deal with it in what they refer to as the lame duck between the election and the end of the calendar year before the new Congress is seated. If they don't deal with it before the new Congress is seated, we have to start all over. So, I think it's, as everybody's aware, it's midterm elections, hyper-partisan at times. People are trying to get reelected or get people not reelected. And, it starts to become, is a word I've used a fair bit over the last couple of months. It becomes, 4-dimensional Rubik's Cube, trying to figure out what's going to happen. But, we're certainly hopeful. We think both the House and Senate bills are good bills. There's a lot of good stuff in both for ducks and duck hunters, and we're just really hopeful we can get it done by so we don't have to restart this all over again. And the other thing about it is, it's obviously really important to ducks and duck hunters, and that's what I spend my time worrying about. But pretty uncertain times in farm country right now with all the trade stuff going on. And I personally, independent of my interest in ducks and duck hunting, I'd sure like our farmers and ranchers to have some certainty in the universe. It just makes their lives a lot easier when they're taking on the kinds of risks farmers do every year to make sure that we've got a good farm bill that works for America's farmers and ranchers. And I'd sure like them to have that certainty of a bill in law too. So.
Yeah, it's a pretty critical piece of legislation for a lot of people on a lot of different fronts. So to hear you talk about having to potentially start over on that is really frustrating. And let's hope that if they're able to come together and get something squared away in time so that doesn't happen. But it feels like just yesterday we were talking about the Farm Bill getting passed and all of the things that was coming from it, and all that kind of stuff. So it's crazy to think about how time flies. And for guys like us, we see these articles on the Farm Bill come out, and we read about how they're going to benefit duck hunters and ducks and farmers and things like that. And then, for a lot of people, they turn that part of their, turn that out of their brain and they move on and they, go on with things. And, sometimes they forget that there's guys like you that are out there living this every day, continuing to push. So hopefully all that hard work that you and, everyone that's pushing on this legislation, hopefully it comes to fruition and, we're all, in a better position for it.
Well, the thing about it is, I think lots of people at first blush go, why in the hell would anybody spend time on the Farm Bill if you cared about ducks? And what a lot of people don't understand is that it's the single greatest investment the American public makes in private land conservation, period. I think it's pretty safe to say it's life or death for prairie ducks. And so, yeah, it's of incredible importance, and it's long. If I showed you guys printed out a meeting list over the last 2.5 years, it'd gag a maggot. It's a pile of All right, guys. Well, I've kept you up too late. I'm sitting out here in flyover country. I'm an hour behind you. You guys got to be gassed. So we can let me know when you want to do it again. I'm always delighted to be on the air. It's fun to be able to cover these topics in something more than 10 or 12 minutes. So I always enjoy the format. Yeah. You guys ask great questions, and it's always a real delight to be on with you.
Yep, and a lot of guys probably know this, but for those that don't, you're in the Facebook group. So if you hear this conversation and you've got questions, post them into the Facebook group, and between all of the other important stuff that he's doing, you may just get a response from John in there from time to time, and get good information right from the source. So, John, we appreciate your time as always. Best of luck getting with the farm bill. Best of luck on your hunting season, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, again, we'd like to thank John, and he came on with us in short notice, spent a ton of time with us, gave us a ton of information, and just all around a really good dude. And and glad having him back on the show again. And, we will certainly do it again in the future. But, the numbers thing it is what it is, right? It's kind of one of those things you don't really know what to make of it sometimes, because you don't know really how those numbers are being derived and all that kind of stuff. But hopefully his insight provided a little bit of clarity. And, as you mentioned, there's some big decisions coming up and some big things that we all need to be kind of watching for and hoping work out, in the duck hunter's favor.
Yeah, not only that, but, when these numbers come out and you see the up arrow or down arrow, and then you look at the bag limits like we talked about, and you don't know how they come up with it. I think it was pretty cool how he broke it down into the 4 categories really, and the adults and juvies and whatnot. So, to get that insight and know that there is a mathematical formula that only a few people understand, it's at least there's more to it than just saying, let's change this or change that. But it's pretty intense by the sound of it.
Yeah. A lot goes into it. Math is hard, so I don't even try to understand that stuff. But, glad we got, good people working on our side and working, on behalf of the duck hunter. So, again, thanks to John. And, I'm just kind of realizing right now, we have not mentioned the 100th episode giveaway, and it's 3 weeks out.
Yeah, this is 97. What we added Mountain Ops and Nathan Loda, a painting that he will do, oil painting of your dog or a hunting scene that you have. And Mountain Ops came in pretty big with a few different supplements for you. So we're still adding, and I know of one that we'll be adding this week coming. So stay tuned. Make sure you're getting your daily entries. A great response. I don't know. I guess I didn't know what to expect with it, but I think it has exceeded expectations. And besides that, we're breaking daily download numbers and weekly, and we're just crushing monthly records right now. So we definitely appreciate all the support, and we're trying our best on this end to keep giving content that you guys appreciate and can take out in the field or talk about with other hunters. So just good stuff, man. I'm just happy to be on this end of it. And, the giveaway, it's really cool to be on this side, and I cannot wait to do the 100th episode with you and name those people that win all these awesome prizes, over $18,000 worth of prizes now. So it's awesome. That's all I can say about it.
Yeah. I'm excited about the giveaway, and we're going to just do our best to get the word out over the next couple of weeks, because it's just such a cool opportunity. And I mean, there's 5 people that are listening to this show right now that are going to win hunts. And there's, people out there listening to this show that are going to win a case of Heavy Shot, and they're going to win a Yeti cooler, and they're going to win a Delta wading jacket from Sitka. A lot of really, really cool stuff. So we want to get that out there and see some people winning some great gear and some good quality stuff. And, again, it's just, this wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the support of all these amazing companies in the industry getting behind this. So thank you to all of them for making it possible.
I have, just thinking about someone spending duck season in a new canoe from Old Town or something, and I'm getting screenshots from people that are joining like interior design groups on Facebook that have like 100,000 members just so they can get their referral points. And I was like, you know what? We have photographers that some of these interior design people could really use. You know, they could use some of these pictures or whatnot. So, you know, it makes sense, and people are trying to get every point that they can, every entry that they can, and it's funny. It's been really fun. It's been a lot of work, but it's been really fun. And like you said, we couldn't do it without the great people in the industry that are chipping in on this. So it's all good stuff.
Yeah, no doubt. So as I mentioned, it's after midnight here. I'm pretty worn out. I know you've been on the road, so you're probably in the same. You got any one last things you want to throw in here before we wrap this one up?
No, man. You know, we got a couple tangle-free A-frame blinds that I might have to lay out tomorrow and have the kids get muddy on. Let them play with it and mud up and get ready to take out Saturday morning. So I cannot believe that season is here already. It's crazy. And it's funny because I was looking through notes here. I have a notebook and I jot some things down, and I mean, it's gone so fast. I think the one page that I opened up to is episode 79, Ramsey Russell. It seemed like that was just 2 weeks ago when we had him on. So, I mean, time is flying. This is 97. You know, we'll have 98, 99 out, and then 100th episode. Make sure you listen and see if your name gets called, because I don't know how long we're going to wait. We're going to keep that on just on the show for a couple days, probably a few days, maybe a week, and before we actually post the winners up, I think is the game plan.
Yeah, it'll be something like that. You know, I also am thinking while I'm sitting here, episode 98 has the potential to be the first ever episode that you and I have recorded together in person.
That's pretty nuts.
Oh, yeah.
That's crazy. But yeah, that'll probably be after the opener.
Yep. So we'll be able to talk about,
and we have
our first
we have
time.
a lot of good. I want to say good, but great guests lined up, and we'll have to mix that in somewhere as well. The opener and everything that went in with it. So a lot of good stuff, man. Maybe we'll have to come out with like a 98.5 episode or something.
Yeah, we'll have to see how it goes when we're together. Maybe we'll create some additional content, but time will tell. I'm going to have the family with me, so who knows what they'll be wanting to do and all that good stuff. But anyway, I don't want to drag this one out any longer. We're already pretty long on this episode, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up, but want to take a second to make sure I thank Off Grid Food Company, Gunner Kennels, Bad Grammar Academy, 737 Duck and Goose Calls, Mount Airy Waterfowl, Club of Warsaw, Virginia, Camp Chef, Black Rifle Coffee Company, and Native Eyewear. Again, thank you to all of those companies. Make sure you head over to our website, check out the discount page, see how you can save some cash on some awesome waterfowl gear. We've got some HP hats still for sale on the website. I know a lot of people have been asking. Barrel decals and decals and things of that nature are coming. Just trying to get some stuff squared away with that, but they are on their way. I'm working on that as we speak, so that will be back in stock on the website here in short order as well. So hang in there. We appreciate all of the support, and appreciate all you guys supporting the companies that support us as well. All right, that does it for 97 episodes of the HP Outdoor Waterfowl Podcast in the book. Thank you to John Devney of Delta Waterfowl for spending some time with us and breaking down the 2018 survey numbers. If you're new to the show, make sure you check out iTunes or our website, get caught up on all the past episodes. If you're heading over to iTunes, make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review. That helps other people just like you find our show. Season's here. Next week, Dan and I will have had a hunt in the book, so we'll be ready to talk about that. So until then, for Dan, I'm Josh. Take care.